The Premier League clubs are set to vote once again in November for the potential rejig of profit and sustainability rules, this time potentially introducing the previously suggested but previously rejected iteration of anchoring, a rule that will essentially peg a salary cap to the top teams in the Premier League based on a multiplier of the bottom team's revenue generation in the league on any given season. It comes with a lot of controversy, a lot of takes, good and bad, lots of pros and lots of cons. But the mainstream media this morning are spinning this in a way that to me appears to once again look to protect the uneven balance, the unlevel playing field in which the teams with the deepest pockets seem to always have the advantage. Now, I'm all for ambition. I'm all for the capitalism idea within football that there should be the ability for wealthier teams, more successful teams, to have a sporting advantage over those that are trying to emulate them. But that shouldn't remove the ability for fair, competitive opportunity for those that are hindered and that are hand-tied by the rules as they currently sit. We're going to go through this particular article that explains the situation. Then we're going to pivot to a couple of articles out from the Mirror and elsewhere that explain their take that suggests that this is the worst idea in the world. I'm not sure where I land. I think I land on the idea that in principle, that the game is getting to the point with the inability for the Premier League to craft a coherent set of rules that are enforceable, that will allow for a slight opportunity, at least, for more teams other than the mainstream 4 or 5 teams that always seem to pick up 92, 93% of all of the trophies that could be won, that have been won in the last 25 years, having gone in those directions. We're going to talk about it right now on Sean Butler TV. Welcome back. Please do smash the like button if you enjoy this sort of football finance content. Hit the subscribe as well if you haven't already. Hit the notification bell and drop a comment. Let me know your thoughts on the topic. I do appreciate all of the support you guys have been showing the channel as it's been reborn in the last few weeks. Let's get straight into this, and I will zoom in so that we can take a look-see and see what this one is saying. The Premier League, this is from goal.com, but I could have picked any number of articles from yesterday that spoke about this. The Premier League set to vote on potential salary cap, with arch rivals Manchester United and Manchester City poised to oppose the plan. The Premier League is reportedly set to vote on proposals that could see a salary cap of sorts introduced at the top end of English football. An anchoring plan has been drawn up which would limit spending for elite clubs, with shareholders expected to address that issue in November. Several teams, including Manchester rivals United and City, are said to oppose the concept. The Times reports on how arch rivals from Old Trafford and the Etihad have expressed concerns regarding the introduction of regulations that would restrict Premier League clubs to spending 5 times what they generate from prize money and broadcast revenue on wages and transfers. The said proposals were first introduced in March 2024, with a poll taken at the time. It is claimed 16 voted in favour, with City, United, Villa opposing the plan, while Chelsea abstained. An abstention, for what it's worth, is the same as a rejection, because I think you have to have 14 votes in favour of changes for them to be seen through. The reason it was paused, it was decided to be shelved at the time. If you remember last year, I think it was around October, around this time last year, Manchester City ended up suing the Premier League with regards to the associated party transactions rule. That has subsequently been settled out of court recently, with Manchester City essentially saying that yes, that the rules are in fact fair and legal, but the compromise from the Premier League was to basically allow them to have their previously rejected £1 billion Etihad sponsorship deal, that with something called an escalator effect, which in essence allows a 10-year long-term contract to bake in things like inflation. So a £1 billion 10-year contract will actually turn out being something closer to £1.5 billion, which would be the biggest stadium naming rights deal and sponsorship deal for the shirt as well in the Premier League history. But they obviously at the time said that the rules weren't okay, because if it's good, what's good for the goose has to be good for the gander. If those things are unfair, then as two should be the director loans situation where people like the Cronkies, for example, can essentially loan their football clubs that they own money at zero or near zero interest rates. And if one of those things should be seen as uncompetitive in essence, then so should the other. Manchester City claimed at the time that the entire process, the entire argument was anti-competitive and it wouldn't fly in any other industry. The reality is that, listen, that they are right. Like both situations, if one is not okay, the other one shouldn't be. But the Premier League ended up saying, well, yeah, you're right. So on that basis, we'll allow both to be okay in the end, in the essence. And it's turned out to be the sticking point as to why, whilst that was up in the air, these potential moves towards this anchoring and the rules that were going to mimic the UEFA PSR and squad cost ratio rules were also held up. Aston Villa chairman, the Egyptian guy, I forget his name at the time, said that there's no point in voting on any of these things because we need to figure out the relationship with APT and all those things first, and that there's more problems to come with regards to legalities if those things turn out to be more problematic than it appears on paper. There's definitely two angles and two arguments and two sort of different groups of minds within the ownership of the Premier League clubs regarding how to move forward with trying to create a balanced, sustainable and fairer ecosystem, but at the same time not trying to quell ambition. Let's carry on with the story and we'll come back to the details in a second. Said proposals were concerns are said to have been raised regarding the negative impact such rules would have on the Premier League's ability to retain its status as the strongest domestic competition in Europe. Teams on the continent are already governed by UEFA's squad cost ratio rules, which aim to reduce spending to 70% of revenue. That's teams that participate in European competitions. So in the Champions League, the Europa League, and the Europa Conference League. The Premier League's proposal would set that bar at 85%. So teams that are already qualifying and participating in Europe already have to work to more stringent restrictions. So it's really just something that's going to be more relevant to the teams that aren't in European competitions that currently have to work within the Premier League's sustainability rules and financial fair play rules. And those rules essentially are more around how much money a team can lose. If they have the backing of the owners, then £105 million over a 3-year rolling period is the general rule. But that was going to be scrapped and they were going to bring in this 85% threshold with the anchoring plan running alongside. Now, clubs in England already operate under PSR. Oh, it says that here, sorry. If we bring these anchoring rules, it could dramatically affect the Premier League's ability to attract the world's best players. How can that be in the best interests of English football? It is suggested that if the anchoring rules were to be introduced, then some teams would immediately be in breach of them, given estimated spending figures. It is reported that sanctions would include a minimum 6-point deduction plus a point for every £6.5 million of overspend. Now, in a nutshell, what the anchoring rule is, I just want to make sure if it doesn't say it here in the article, I don't think it does. The anchoring rule essentially says that whoever the bottom revenue generating football club is in the Premier League, let's use like a Burnley, for example, and then they were to be making circa £120 million a year in revenue, then there would be a 5 times multiplier on that, which would equal about £600 million. And then that number, if it was deemed to be lower than the 85% of revenue generated threshold that would also work in alignment with it, so the lesser of those two numbers would be the limit. Now, the first things first, all of these insiders and the other articles we're going to come to, they all talk about this from a perspective of the very best teams won't be able to compete with the likes of Real Madrid and Barcelona because those same limitations won't exist for PSG, for Real Madrid and Barcelona. And so some of the best players will leave the Premier League and go where they can earn more money. Now, my immediate counter to that is, well, there's literally only going to be one team at the moment that would fall afoul of this particular threshold, and that would be Manchester City. And the arguments that Manchester United's Sir Jim Ratcliffe put forward that they don't want it either, and teams like Chelsea, etc. Well, if they all feel the same, there's 4 teams maybe that will feel the same about this. Those 2 of those teams are the teams that are currently facing charges, one for 115 breaches. As you know, on this channel, we've spoken about this ad nauseum, which we'll find the results out for very soon. And the other team, Chelsea, are also facing their own charges of 74 historical breaches of breaking the current rules as they have existed. in different iterations over the past. And those two teams alone are responsible for winning about 65% of all of the domestic trophies that could be won in the last 15 years or so. And so if the teams that are winning everything anyway are already suspected of and alleged to have broken all of the rules that currently sit in existence, and even as we speak, the amount of rules that are so open with their ability to create loopholes allows teams to just move money around, buying a hotel from yourself and selling it back, women's teams, those sorts of things, sorting out new multi-club ownership models where you can essentially just loan players out to your new feeder clubs. All of those things essentially could be seen as anti-competitive, but the inability, as I've always said, the inability for these clubs and the Premier League generally to create a coherent set of rules that are enforceable create the need for more and more of this sort of ambiguity and issuance anyway. And let's be entirely honest, this notion that a team like Manchester City will end up losing players like Erling Haaland maybe to Real Madrid, if it was all about money, then those players would be filling up the Saudi leagues, or previously the Chinese leagues, or before that the Russian leagues, when those sorts of areas were throwing money left, right and centre at those players. The fact that not everybody goes to those sorts of countries to play football, despite the eye-watering money that they can earn, that is 4 or 5, 10 times in some cases higher than the already eye-watering sums that they earn in the Premier League, suggests that it isn't all about money and it isn't all about greed. A lot of it does come down to happiness, comes down to where you want to play, the caliber of the league, the quality of the league, the opportunities that it presents, and of course, being more around other things in football, about what you can achieve. Now, Real Madrid only has a squad of 24 that's allowed, so not every player that earns an extortionate amount of money in the Premier League who happens to play for Manchester City or for any of the other 2 or 3 teams that might eventually fall afoul of these sorts of things, is going to be able to leave or would be wanted by those clubs anyway. The argument that is represented that this is something that shouldn't happen simply because it will damage the ability for Manchester City or 1 or 2 other teams to be able to continue to have their stranglehold, of which they only created, by the way, by getting in front of the rules before they existed, or for having the rules trying to close on them long after the horse has bolted, is quite frankly ridiculous, in my opinion. Let's carry on with the story, though. The clubs in question are said to believe that rules will actually make the Premier League more competitive as they help to level the playing field somewhat. I've listed here. Those voting in favour of the reforms have been warned that they risk seriously undermining the competitiveness of English top-flight football. Another source told The Times, many clubs don't have a particularly strong view on this issue because they don't think it will affect them given their current spending levels. It feels like we are actually sleepwalking into this. Not sleepwalking into it. It's just that the argument is that should we allow the teams that have got ahead through breaking rules, for already having access to obscene amounts of money that nobody else has got access to, that those teams are the ones that might be affected by it in a very small sample size and only in a very minor way, and that everybody else would rather see a limitation on their ability to continue to use that advantage that was ill-gotten in the first place to be able to continue their success. Their argument, I don't know who these sources are, but I'm sure the sources have their own bias. Maybe you'll accuse me of having my own. It feels like we are actually sleepwalking into this. The clubs in question, i.e. the other 14 teams that voted for it in favour in principle, said to believe that the rules will actually make the Premier League more competitive as they help to level the playing field somewhat, ensuring that the division remains attractive to broadcasters in multi-billion pound deals. Let's be honest, guys, as I said, at the top end of the table, I think since 2001, 91% of all trophies have been won by the same 5 teams. Then there's about 2 teams that have won 2 trophies and 6 or 7 teams that have won 1 trophy in the last 25 years. And most of those teams are no longer in the Premier League at all. At the bottom end of the pitch, at the bottom end of the table, you essentially, maybe this year might be different, but you essentially have the same 3 teams that go up are the same 3 teams that go down. So there's very little jeopardy of relegation. There's very little opportunity of real success because the rules are in place now to curtail teams that have ambitions to be able to spend a little bit more money. But this doesn't reflect that. These rules will not curtail those ambitions. They will only, the anchoring specifically will only limit the ability for teams like Manchester City to create revenue streams over £1 billion and then be able to spend 700-800 million, whatever it is, on their numbers. Now remember that this anchoring rule is only going to work alongside an 85% threshold, which is already higher than the 70% threshold that teams who operate in Europe are already having to abide by. So It really just simplifies the rules. It streamlines them rather than having two sets of rules, one around losses, one around spend. It makes it a little bit easier. Everyone can get their numbers in order. But for some reason, the narrative that's getting put around in all of the media today supports more of the protective state around what can we do to make sure that the teams that currently have all of the advantages continue to have it. Let's carry on. The last thing you want is for the top clubs in the Premier League not to be able to compete with Real Madrid, Barcelona, Bayern Munich, PSG. That's absurd. And if it does, it then ceases to be the finest league in the world. Like the German league operates, I think 18 teams in the Bundesliga, guys, has a 50+1% fan ownership model. They have a completely different relationship with finances, a completely different relationship with spend, and they have a different propensity to develop youth. There is many advantages to different pivots into different ownership structures that don't exist in the Premier League, where it isn't all about the deepest pockets wins. And that, to me, this argument that Real Madrid and Barcelona and Bayern Munich will run away with everything is just silly. It's absolutely silly, and it doesn't make any sense. Everton and Nottingham Forest are among the clubs to have been stung with PSR punishments, having faced points deductions, while Manchester City remain locked in a 115 charge financial fair play case. We'll find out what happens there. I want to pivot just quickly to this article from the Mirror this morning that again is pushing the narrative that this idea of of moving to an anchoring system is somehow going to be curtains for the Premier League. To me, it doesn't add up. There is literally one team that would be in trouble from it at the moment, and they have all of the ability with their various resources, their youth team strategy, their multi-club ownership, their 17 clubs, I think it is, that they can draw their benefits from. They're the only team that would be affected by this in a negative way. Everybody else that is sort of is outside of Europe. Well, if they have the ambitions of trying to get into Europe anyway, as soon as they would qualify, for example, Nottingham Forest qualifying this year and getting into the Europa League, Crystal Palace being in the Conference League through their own, all of that stuff I won't get into, those teams have to immediately adhere to a 70% threshold. So the rules this change would just make it easier for them. And everybody else that's coming up, well, they stop having to worry about how much money they're losing and start having to worry more about how much money they're spending, which is good for the goose and good for the gander anyway. Let's carry on with the story. It says spending restrictions via a salary cap. This is obviously an op-ed. Would put the reputation and well-being of English football's top flight at serious risk, and would eventually see the biggest names head elsewhere. The billionaires in Saudi Arabia will be rubbing their hands together, and so will the presidents of some of the biggest clubs across Europe, like Real Madrid, Barcelona, and Bayern Munich, because coming to them all soon could be some of the biggest and best footballers on the planet. As I mentioned already, if Saudi Arabia, if money was the be all and end all, Bruno Fernandes would have left Manchester United for £100 million in the summer and picked up whatever he was going to get paid. I think it was £1 million a week. He didn't, because money wasn't the be all and end all to him. Not everybody in football leaves at the first hurdle to go to these areas of the world to play football where money is no object. And in terms of if we're looking at 2 or 3 teams, there is still a limit on the amount of players that they can have in their squads, and they still have to operate to the same 70% squad cost ratios that all of the teams in the Premier League do. Real Madrid still has to operate to a 70% ratio. So does Barcelona, so does Bayern Munich, so does Tottenham, so does Forest, Villa. Everybody in Europe has to operate to that same threshold. The only difference here is for teams not participating in Europe, they would have an 85% threshold, and the teams that already have obscene revenue generation because of their success, in the main part because of the alleged breaches of previous FFP rules that weren't worth the paper they were written on, suddenly they're going to have their wings clipped a little bit. I don't understand the way that there's really no one out there in the market that's talking about this from a different perspective, where it's good. It should be seen as a good move for the competitive interests of the Premier League. To not know who's going to win a trophy every year, to sit there and think anyone could win the title. Not that this will solve for that, but it will bring it a little bit closer. That should be seen as a good thing. Most of which currently earn their livings in the Premier League, because it remains the richest league in the world, the one which can facilitate clubs spending up to 500 grand a week on certain individuals. But all of this could be about to change, and a move which would leave the Premier League languishing alongside the also-rans. Gee whiz. The introduction of a controversial new salary cap will be voted on by all top clubs in the coming weeks, known as anchoring. It would limit the amount of money any side can spend to a multiple at the bottom, as we've spoken about. You'll be stunned to discover the likes of Liverpool, Chelsea, and both United clubs are opposed to the proposal. Well, Liverpool weren't opposed to it before. Chelsea abstained. Manchester United, I don't believe, opposed it either in its principal format beforehand. Because, in short, the new rules would block some of the biggest clubs doling out the biggest wages of some of the biggest stars, which could see the likes of Erling Haaland and co. decide to leave English football in their droves, rendering those clubs they leave behind powerless to compete with the best the continent has to offer. It's absolutely madness. It's a lie. And leaving the Premier League status at the best in the business in absolute tatters. Unbelievable. Because broadcasters would no longer be prepared to shell out fortunes in return for showing live games, instead choosing to show matches that involve the superstar names plying their trade somewhere else. Do me a favour. Do me a favour. What are we talking about here? A more competitive playing field would it improve the eyeballs on the Premier League, not reduce it. People don't buy the Premier League rights because they want to watch Erling Haaland. They buy it because they want to watch the best football games happen. Sometimes that involves just having some superstars. But is there many eyeballs on the Saudi Arabian League, despite Ronaldo being there? Isn't that what that whole thing was about with the Saudi Arabian League, to try to make it a Goliath? Has it worked? No. Who talks about it? Not many people. The Premier League is swimming in dollars because it's the best product, but inhibits certain clubs from employing those who make it the best product. And the end game is a scenario League Chief Executive Richard Masters shouldn't even want to consider. I almost don't want to read any more of this. In fact, I'm not going to, because I've got to the end of the article. But there's more and more and more of these sorts of articles out there right now, guys. Simon Jordan has also waved in on some of these takes, more regarding PSR generally. And he says that the rules aren't fit for purpose. And he's right on that. They haven't been fit for purpose. But that doesn't mean we should scrap them. We should be changing it to a world that offers some sort of level playing field. He's saying, I'm happier with little governance and regulation over business and sport. The big area which needs to be attacked was wages, but the genie is out of the bottle. Why it works in the NFL is that they own the league. No other country has similar leagues. Sustainability is the most ridiculous phrase ever coined. When you look at their owners in the Premier League, sustainability doesn't form their thinking. It's a box ticked. Some owners are nation states. 100%. 100%. But do we want the alternative? Do we want a situation where the only way for you to see your football club to ever win a trophy is if you happen to be taken over by a nation state as well? To me, it's madness. Let me know your thoughts, guys, and I'll leave it there. Like, subscribe, and comment. And as always,